We're so excited to have a very special guest with us today. We have U.S. Rep. Katie Porter, who represents California's 45th Congressional District, which is the heart of Orange County for all you non-Californians out there. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to chat with us.
I'm excited to do it.
And so I wanted to ask, recently it was announced that you are the new chair of the Natural Resources Oversight Committee. And I wanted to ask, what kind of work are you planning for this committee? What is the jurisdiction like? And how might it complement the work of your colleagues on the House Oversight and Reform Committee?
So I serve both on the House Oversight and Reform Committee and on the House Natural Resources Committee. Within these substantive committees, like Natural Resources, which is in charge of protecting our public resources, our public lands, our oceans, our water, our air, each of those does investigations and oversight work into their subject matter. And so I am the chair of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee for Natural Resources. So what we'll be doing is taking a look at issues that are maybe developing. They're not quite ready for legislation yet, but we need to understand them better. So one great example of this is zoonosis, which is when a disease moves from an animal disease into potentially being able to leap over into being a human disease. Obviously something we're all very interested in the wake of this pandemic. And that is something that the folks at Parks and Lands, for example, have a lot of jurisdiction over. So that's the kind of thing that we could do an investigation about. It could be into a corporate wrongdoer, a polluter. It could be into whether the government is actually using our public resources to benefit taxpayers and the American public.
That's a great segue into my question for you, Congresswoman, and thank you so much for being with us today. So you've actually hit on something that's been bugging me about the way the Trump administration ran our oil and gas leasing program, which was that they lowered the amount that the fossil fuel companies were required to pay the government in exchange for these leases and for the royalties on the actual amount that they take out of the ground. And you're looking at this now. Tell us how you are looking at this issue and what you hope to do about it.
It's actually really interesting. It goes back to a law that we passed in the 1920s called the Mineral Lands Act, Mineral Leasing Act. And what that did is set the royalty rate, which is the share of whatever you extract from the land, whatever that's worth, the oil or gas, you pay a portion of it. And part of that goes to the federal government who owns these public lands and back to the Treasury. Part of it goes to the states that are within those public lands. That royalty rate for onshore drilling of oil and gas has not been changed in over 100 years.
Wow.
And there's a huge discrepancy between that rate and, for example, the royalty rate that we charge for offshore drilling or with a rate that states charge to drill on their public land. So if you think about a state like California or Colorado, Texas, they have both federal protected lands and state protected lands. The price to drill federal public lands is 50% cheaper, sometimes even 100% cheaper than the cost of drilling on the state public lands. What's the effect of this? Taxpayers are not getting the revenue that we are owed that could be plowed back into environmental restoration, coastal restoration, conservation, public access to lands, infrastructure in our public lands. And the oil companies and gas companies are basically getting our resources on the cheap. That needs to stop. And so that's why I have a bill to raise that onshore drilling rate and to address some of the other really giveaways in our mineral leasing system.
Yeah, I think people don't appreciate that that gas belongs to the public and that it's not that we're paying any less because they pay less to get it out of the public lands that the federal government owns. We just are giving more of it to the fossil fuel companies to put in their own pockets. So
adds up to billions and billions of dollars, which would make a huge difference as we think about President Biden's plan to set aside 30% of our land for public lands. We call this the 30%, the 30 by 2030 initiative. The more land we set aside as public land, there will be pressure to drill on that or to extract gas from that. We need to make sure that we're protecting those lands. This additional land, Biden has said, additional land that is part of the 2030 program cannot have extraction going on. You can't drill or produce oil on it, which means there's going to be a lot more efforts to drill on the prior leased lands. We need to make sure we're getting our fair share for that.
To pivot a little bit, I wanted to ask, you are from a purple district, and when you ran in 2018, you didn't shy away from environmental and climate issues. And I wanted to ask, how did that go over with your constituents? And what was your calculation in putting the environment front and center as part of your message in your campaign?
Well, the 45th 45th Congressional District is the heart of Orange County and includes a lot of communities that I think we would describe as suburban, although we're, 45 minutes, an hour from Los Angeles, about an hour and a half from San Diego. So we really are our own metro area. But one of the really wonderful things about the 45th District is that about half of all the land is preserved land. And it's a combination of city land that's been set aside as part of development, national forest, the Cleveland National Forest is here, Whiting Ranch, a lot of preserved lands. And so people here understand our preserved lands are a major benefit to our quality of life, to our clean air. And if you look at the history of Orange County, one of the reasons people moved here, actually away from LA or moved here instead of some of those bigger urban environments at that time in the 60s and 70s, was to escape air and water pollution. So I think there's a real understanding that this is important. We're also 3 to 5 miles, depending on where you are, from the coast. And it's a major driver of tourism and economic opportunity and growth here. So I think we have to think both about the environment as something that is important to our quality of life, that has implications for social and environmental justice, but also as an economic treasure that has helped Orange County grow and become the kind of community that it is. So I think you have to talk about both of those points. So you're helping people understand the full range of reasons across the ideological and political spectrum that environmental protection is something that we should all embrace. We also are in historically Reagan country. When Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California, Orange County was a big part of that push. And Reagan himself was quite the conservationist when he was governor. So there's a lot of kind of return to that kind of ideology that I think you can tap into here.
Yeah, another thing that is a uniter of an issue rather than a divider, something people don't think of in terms of environmental issues, but most of the public is really behind clean energy and renewable energy in particular. So I just wanted to ask you about a bill that you introduced last year to help consumers understand where their power is coming from. And hopefully that will help them to be able to ask their power companies to buy more, to deliver them more renewable energy. So tell us about that effort.
Yeah, it's a bill that's about consumers' access to grid information, which I think, the whole idea of an electrical grid and energy grid is something that a lot of people are sort of hyper aware of in the wake of what happened in Texas. Wow. But so what the bill would do, it's actually based on an app that my colleague, Mike Levin, a wonderful environmentalist who represents the district right south of here, showed me consumers can go and check in California how much of our electricity is being generated by renewables and what kind of renewables. So the bill would provide for the development of these kinds of apps and consumer information to this. It's really important because we hear so many misconceptions and they span the range from people who say everything I do is renewable. Probably not, because at least some portions of our energy, some portions of the year, no matter how environmentally conscious you are, come from fossil fuels. And other people who say, we don't get any energy from, renewable sources here in state Y or Z. That's also probably not true. Many of those states actually have significant wind, water, solar resources. So this also fits well into the movement for community choice energy, energy choice, which we've seen a lot of communities here in Orange County adopt, which is really the philosophy that communities ought to have a say in what kinds of energy sources they're using, because communities bear both the financial cost, but also the social and public health consequences of what kinds of energy they choose. So as a consumer protection advocate before I came to Congress, I think information in the hands of both consumers and my constituents is almost always a helpful thing.
To ask a bit more of a fun question, we know that you're a surfer, you represent a district that has abundant natural spaces and the beach, but what inspires you to protect the environment in your capacity as a legislator?
Well, I think some of this comes from also being a mother. I think I see in my children that they have had a different education. They have seen and dug into the science behind what is happening to our planet in a way that I didn't when I was a kid. So, my oldest son has a sign on his door that says, zero emissions by 2030 or do not enter. The constant reminder of how important this is to young people. I also think about it a lot in terms of economic growth. Orange County grew a lot initially because we were building houses, we were drawing people into wonderful places to live, but we're now up against the sort of edges of the land that we've set aside as preserved land. What's going to help our economy grow for the next 20, 30, 50 years? It's going to be clean energy jobs and micro and advanced manufacturing jobs. And the country that is able to win these jobs globally is going to be the country that figures out how to manufacture with as much renewable energy and in as clean of way as possible. China is not investing in clean energy many multiples times of what we are because they love panda bears more than Americans love bald eagles. They're doing it because they understand that it's part of building a globally competitive economy for the next generation or even next century. And so I try to think about sort of what is the long range planning. And I think too often in Congress, we have to confront immediate crises. And I think that now that we're understanding that the climate is an immediate crisis, that's helping us to prompt taking immediate action on doing something.
That's why it's wonderful to have women like you in Congress, because they're taking a little bit of that longer view and thinking about what's good, not just for today, but for our kids and our grandkids. We're thrilled to have you here actually as part of our series of interviews during Women's History Month. And lots of young women look up to you, Congresswoman, because of your wonderful work in Congress and how well you represent women as well as your district. Tell us a little bit about this thing that's made you famous. And my kids are going to laugh because we have a whiteboard in our house that's kind of infamous. So tell us about your whiteboard and sort of your philosophy about how to prep for things and what makes you so good at what you do.
Yeah, no, the whiteboard is really a tool for teaching. And I was a professor before I came to law school. And so, you'll ask a question and the students will often say, can you repeat that? And congressional witnesses, CEOs, they know the same bag of tricks. When you ask them, what are you going to do about your emissions? Can you repeat that? So the whiteboard can be a tool to help make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. We're all trying to get to an answer, and then to really document what people have to say for themselves. And these hearings, they are for the American people. They are opportunities for the American people to learn. What do CEOs have to say for themselves? What do government officials have to say about the problems that we're facing? What can change? Are they taking responsibility? And the whiteboard can be a tool either to map out a problem or sometimes to write down an answer. One of my favorite whiteboard moments was one where actually nothing got written on the whiteboard at all. I said to a CEO, you've made all of this money off perpetually raising the prices despite the product, the life-saving drug, not getting any better. Tell me why you deserve to be paid this amount of salary when you haven't actually improved anything for patients. And I said, I have an empty whiteboard here to write down your reasons. And there was something about confronting that empty whiteboard, knowing that his answers were going to be written down, that I think left him realizing that he didn't have a very good explanation for shareholders, for consumers, for patients, and for the American public.
That is exactly why we love you, Congresswoman Porter. You just, show exactly how to help people understand and to hold them accountable. We really can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk with us today.
Absolutely. It's a delight to talk with you. Thank you for featuring me as part of Women's History Month. One of the wonderful things about the environmental movement is it really does feature from start to current day so many amazing women leaders who have spoken up and fought for their kids, their children, and the future of our planet.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Really appreciate your time.